So what I'm interested in doing is understanding theory and methods for dealing with complex problems. And that's what we're doing today, is a piece of the work that I do. What's of interest to me is that there's a lot of good work around that people have done, but it's very fragmented. So, and I expect you'll have had this experience yourself, that there are lots of useful things around, but it's hard to find anything in one place. So things are very scattered. And so what I'm trying to do is to figure out what are better ways for sharing that information. And I've developed this idea of integration and implementation sciences, which I call I2S for short because it's such a mouthful, as a discipline that can kind of provide the plumbing to connect everybody up, and that's a conduit for sharing. And what I'm really interested in doing is building a community that combines lots of small communities and groups. And hopefully that'll be a bit clearer as we progress. So where does transdisciplinarity fit into all that? So transdisciplinarity is obviously a piece of integration and implementation sciences. It's one of the growing communities, which is fantastic to see. It's a term that's used quite loosely, but essentially mostly people use transdisciplinary when the research also includes stakeholders. People can use it in a whole range of ways, but there are some specific intellectual communities that focus on transdisciplinarity. The Europeans look at it differently from the Americans. I'm not going to talk about that, but just kind of to put that on the table. And there are some agreed frameworks for doing it, and there are toolkits and handbooks. There's a biannual conference, there's now a massive open online course, and there's a network that's developing. And I've sent you all, in addition to sending you all a copy of these PowerPoint, I've sent you all a handout, and there are references to a lot of these things on the handout if you're interested in finding out more. And I've also sent you my email address, so if you're interested in knowing more about any of these things, feel free to contact me. So the workshop puts transdisciplinarity into this bigger I2S context. It's going to be a mixture of didactic, reflective and interactive work. We're not going to do a round of introductions because we've got so little time, but every time that you get together as a small group or you speak, it would be great if you introduced yourself. Please ask questions if you need to. If I'm going too fast or something's not clear, feel free to ask. Judith and Makiba are monitoring the comments. I can't manage to do that and talk and look at you at the same time. When we have discussion, and this what probably will only happen right at the very end, I'll call on you. If you don't want to say anything, obviously feel free to say, look, I'd rather just pass. It's just easy, as you know, online, if I say, Judith, would you say something, please? So the slides have been sent to you, plus the resource handouts. Part of what we're also trying to do with this series of workshops is to build links across the projects, and we're going to do that in the small group discussions that we have here. So the focus here is going to be on stakeholder engagement, about what makes transdisciplinarity transdisciplinary, if you like. And I'm going to give you some frameworks, some thinking tools that, you know, there's no perfect way of doing this, but there are some good ways of thinking about it. And we're also going to spend a little time talking about the lessons from experience and developing principles from that. So if I put stakeholder engagement in context, research on complex problems aims to develop a more comprehensive understanding of the problem, both what we know and what we don't know, and this is really what I2S is about, and it aims to support policy and practice change. And stakeholders are really important in both of these. In terms of the integration and implementation sciences framework, I think about it as having these three domains. So what do we know? How do we bring together what we know from disciplines and stakeholders? How do we understand what we don't know? And stakeholders also have a role in that. And then how do we bring together what we know and what we don't know to support policy and practice change? There are a bunch of theories and methods that cut across this. So systems thinking, understanding context, including diversity in what we do, including stakeholders, having participation, integrating all of that, communicating effectively. So those ideas are overlapping, but they also intersect with all of these three domains of the framework. And then there are some specific things that we want to think about. I do emphasize the unknown quite a lot. And then in terms of making change happen, research implementation, decision support, and change are all kind of subtopics of that. So I've been trying to think about a framework for this, and then kind of categories of ideas that intersect with those. So I2S deals with all of these domains and categories. And what we're going to deal with today is particularly participation, and particularly stakeholder participation. And we're going to do a little bit of a foray into change, and hopefully that'll become clearer as we go. So does that give you a kind of a bit of a context? Are there any questions or comments before I move on into the substance?
Yes. Hello?
Yes, please.
Yeah, Marion Glaser from Germany and the No Crisis Project. You mentioned at the beginning that you consider transdisciplinarity when the term also includes stakeholders. And that raises the point with me, are we as researchers not stakeholders? And is it not better to talk about other stakeholders and specify that? Because if we exclude ourselves, we have a problem. No?
Yeah, so Marianne, for the purposes of today, I'm excluding the researchers as stakeholders. So I'm talking about, if you like, everybody else other than the researchers. It just makes the conversation a little bit smoother, but I thank you for the question and thank you for the point, because you know, a lot of people will argue that they want to, you know, that we are also stakeholders in the process. But I guess the perspective that I'm taking from here is the researchers are the people who are organising the process. We're organising the research. And so it's how do we invite other people into the research, and I'll be talking about this a bit more later. But thanks, that kind of helps. Will hopefully be helpful for others too in setting the scene.
Thanks.
All right, so then let's start with thinking about defining, identifying and prioritising stakeholders. So who do we need to include in our research? So it's useful to think about stakeholders in two groups, those who are affected by the problem and those who are in a position to do something about the problem. And it's useful to think about including both groups in our research. What they can contribute is they can help us build a more comprehensive understanding of the problem, and they can also help us think about how the research can be used to support change addressing the problem. So these are not kind of hard and fast rules. What I'm doing here really is giving you thinking tools. So ways of thinking about stakeholders so that you can think about who is good to include in the research. So in terms of building a more comprehensive understanding of the problem, stakeholders not only know stuff, but they have different ways of defining the problem. They can see how the problem connects with other problems. So these are all, as I said briefly at the beginning, systems problems. So everything's connected to everything else. And stakeholders will sometimes see different connections from those that we see. They'll have different understandings of context from the ones that we have. So they'll know something, they may know something about the history of the problem, or something about cultural issues, or something about the politics. They'll often have different values and interests from those that we share. And so considering that's important. And in terms of thinking about what we don't know, they can also be really helpful in helping us think about particular unknowns and also reducing unknowns. So they'll know things that will help us reduce unknowns, but they'll also be worried about things that may help us bring new unknowns to the table. In terms of how stakeholders can help us to use the research to support action on the problem, almost all stakeholders will have new ideas for what policy and practice could do. And one of the important things that the research does is by focusing on a problem, it legitimizes the problem and it legitimizes the concerns of those who are affected by the problem. So those are two important things that working with stakeholders does. If we bring decision makers into the research as stakeholders, they can also really help us think about how what we do can help or hinder them in making change happen. So they can say to us, look, if you frame the problem this way, we won't be able to work with it because it's too politically hot. So I've done a lot of work on drug use, illicit drug use. And so if I frame it as legalization, policymakers can't work with it. If I frame it as a new treatment option, that is something that they can work with. So policymakers can help you think about how to frame your research, what information might be missing. They can help you appreciate some of the contextual factors that might make it easier or harder for you to do what you want to do. So let me say this another way. So complex problems are systems problems. They have no clearly defined limits, and stakeholders can help us identify interconnections, systems interconnections. Complex problems have contested definitions, and stakeholders provide different perspectives on those definitions. And one of the things that is highly contested is values, and stakeholders often bring different values to the table. Complex problems have real-world constraints, contextual constraints, and stakeholders can help us identify those constraints. They have multiple unknowns, and we can't get rid of all the unknowns. We have to learn to deal with a number of them. And stakeholders can help us identify important unknowns and also help us avoid unintended consequences. And then when you bring those together, it highlights a fifth thing about what we do, which is that there are no perfect answers. So that the solutions that we develop through our research can only ever be partial and can only ever be temporary. And so by including stakeholders, we can also help them understand that, because everybody would like a perfect answer to a problem, but we can only ever have imperfect answers. So to continue on then, in terms of defining and identifying stakeholders, stakeholders can be individuals, so there can be people who have specific knowledge or power that we really need to include. Often stakeholders are groups, so there'll be networks or loose affiliations or neighbourhoods or organisations or even the general public. And we then need to think about, are we going to try and work with the whole group, or are we going to work with representatives of the group, and how are we going to get those representatives? You can also include the natural environment as a stakeholder in the work that we do on environmental issues. And to come back to Marianne's point from earlier, for this purpose, I'm not including researchers as stakeholders. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't. Obviously, it's just easier for this discussion. So I don't really have a lot of time to go into processes for identifying stakeholders. So I've pulled together some work, particularly that's been done by a group looking at biodiversity, and given those to you as a handout. And what this does is it lists a number of key questions for identifying stakeholders. It has some processes, some categories, starting with categories and working backwards, a mind map, and we'll talk about this some more at the end if there's time, particularly about identifying stakeholders amongst the people who can make change happen. So another thing that's important to do is to think about who has control. So as researchers, we have control over the research, over developing a more comprehensive understanding of the problem. And so we have the ability to let stakeholders into what we do. In terms of doing something about the problem, we're not the people who are in control. The stakeholders who use the research to support change, the decision makers, they're the ones who have control over that, and they can let us in to those processes. And it's important to remember those differences. So we have control over some things, and we don't have control over other things, and we differentially interact with stakeholders in that way. It can be useful to put this into a 2-by-2 matrix, so it can be useful to think about stakeholders affected by the problem and those in a position to do something about the problem, and then to think about who do we let in to help us get a more comprehensive understanding, and who do we need to let us in so that the research can support action. And again, to use illicit drugs as an example, illicit drug users are the people who are affected by the problem, and the people that I let into the research to help me understand it more effectively. Those who are both affected by the problem and do something about it, but mostly do something about it, police officers and treatment providers. Again, I asked them to be participants so that I could understand more effectively. And then I worked with government policymakers, and while I invited them to be part of the research, they really let me in to help them think about how to support action. So what I'd like you to do is to just reflect for a couple of minutes about the stakeholders that you interact with and where they fit in this matrix. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes to do that. Thank you. And I'm just going to, okay, I hope that's been a challenging exercise. Tatiana, did you want to say something? I see you've been tearing your hair out a bit.
Yes, I can speak about this. I don't know. I can't understand how I can fill in with where I can speak about this.
Oh, sorry. No, it's just for you to think about. There's nowhere that you can actually write anything. Sorry, I should have made that clearer.
Okay. Good thing. Okay. I can speak a little bit about it.
Okay. So I've sent you this. This is all part of the slides that I've sent you. So I think we'll move on, and hopefully it'll be a useful exercise. Karen, did you have something you wanted to ask or say?
No, but I can try to put to name some categories maybe for where we can put the stakeholders in. So for instance, I've been working in Pune in a project on food, water, energy, and we have been working with farmers. So I think the farmers would fit into this first category, affected by the problem, and they can help to build a more comprehensive understanding. But maybe if they're not organized, they cannot do something about it. But then if you have, for instance, civil society organizations who are close to people who are affected, then they would fit more into this. They're also in a position to do something about it because they are getting organized and they're making campaigns or whatever. And then those who can use research to support policy are more the sophisticated NGOs, I would say, research institutes and these kind of organizations, and policymakers themselves.
Right.
Who can do something about it and who can use the research to support change.
Great, thank you. Yes, that's perfect. I mean, I guess that's what I was trying to encourage you all to do, is to, so I should just say that some of you pop up on my screen and I can't see most of you. So if you do want to say something, you'll just have to either send a comment and, send a chat, sorry, and I'm just looking at the chat now. Judith will pick it up, or you just need to speak. So let me move on, because we've got quite a lot to cover, and I do want you to have a chance to really interact in small groups so that you get to know each other. So what I want to do now is to move on to how do we prioritise stakeholders. Usually when we identify stakeholders, we identify many more than we can actually include in the research. And so how do we use our resources most effectively? So it's useful to think about people with power, people with legitimacy, people with urgency, and the context, and not just to focus on the practicalities. Often what we do is we just take who's easiest, and I'm going to argue that maybe that's not always the best thing to do. So let's start with power. It can be useful to think about 3 kinds of power that stakeholders might have. Sometimes they have material or financial resources. Sometimes they have normative power, so they have prestige. Very occasionally they'll have coercive power. We have to take them into account because they can force us to. That's fairly rare in the research area. Often more important for us is who has legitimacy. And the people with the problem often have legitimacy, and in terms of other people, it's people who are working for the public good rather than for their self-interest are the kinds of people that we want to think about including. And it's also important, if we're working with representatives, what type of representation. So people who've been made representatives of a group through a fairly democratic process tend to have more legitimacy than people who are self-appointed representatives of the group. So it's worth thinking about those dimensions of legitimacy. It can also be worth thinking about whether there's any urgency attached to the problem and which stakeholders represent that urgency. And you can put those together in this Venn diagram. So the groups with the highest priority is obviously the group that has power, legitimacy and urgency, group number 1, but also those with power and legitimacy. They have high priority for inclusion in the work that we do. Anybody with legitimacy, whether they also have urgency or only have legitimacy, are also generally fairly high priority. And then we might put, if we can't include everybody, we might put lower down people who just have power and urgency. And those who just are interested in the problem but don't actually have any power or any legitimacy might be the people that we give the lowest priority to. So if I can give you again an example from the drug world, government has high power and high legitimacy, so they were obviously included. They didn't have high urgency. Drug users had high legitimacy, so and high urgency for something to be done. Drug cartels had high power but not legitimacy, so we were a bit dubious about working with them. The governments of other countries, it turned out, were also a really important group, and then the lowest priority are what I would call cranks. So they're always people kind of on the fringes who get in touch with researchers and want to tell you stuff, but they actually don't have a lot to contribute. So Chantel's asked a question of how would those with influence fit in. So yes, influence, I think you can think about as the same as power, different kinds of influence. And Marion, you've got a question. Do you want to go ahead, please?
Yes, I've just typed it. I was relating this to my work, and those who only have urgency, for me that was the poorest, the excluded, those who classically have less voice. If we start off by giving them the lowest priority, we emphasize the kind of marginalization, polarization problems that we already have in the world.
So I would put those in a group with high legitimacy. Why would you not include them as high legitimacy? So anybody who experiences anybody who has the problem, I would see as a group that has high legitimacy.
Okay, but what's urgency then? I mean, then it's that definition that I didn't quite get. If you put them there.
Urgency doesn't work for every problem, but you know, if you're cleaning up after a hurricane, for example, then urgency becomes an issue because people will die if you don't act quickly, and you might triage in the way that they do in medical situations as well. So as I'm saying, these are not perfect tools, they're thinking tools, and if they can help you think about things, and I'm very happy for you to do exactly what you did, Marion, which is to say, this doesn't make any sense to me and I think this is wrong. You know, that's kind of the discussion that we want to be having, and very soon I'm going to encourage you to go into small groups to actually talk amongst each other about all of this, because we have so many people. You know, we've got over 30 people enrolled. I'd love to do this in plenary because I really want to hear what you've got to say too, but we can't get through a lot of material and give everybody a chance to speak. So what I've decided is probably a fairer way to give everybody a chance to speak and to share experiences is to have those discussions in small groups.
Yeah, okay.
So I want to just, you've already been thinking along with this, so maybe we can just spend 30 seconds on this, is for you to think about where you would put stakeholders in your in your work, what group they would go into. And I'm sorry I didn't explain legitimacy as well as I should have. Certainly anybody who's, yeah, so Alexandra's asked the question, what about public interest organisations? They have high legitimacy but low power. Yeah, so one of the reasons why I give people with high legitimacy and low power also high priority is that that is the case for a lot of groups. And so one of the good things about research is that by including them, we actually help give them some power. And one of the things we do when we bring people to the table is by recognising the legitimacy of their cause is that we use our power, if you like, as researchers to give them to the picture. So, so the reason why I would include both power and legitimacy is high priority to include. Okay. So then let me just move on to context. This is a bit of a grab bag of ideas, but you might also, when you're trying to prioritise who to include, you might think about who have we used previously, who was good value, who can cast some light on what the context is, the historical, political, economic, cultural circumstances of the research, who might know something that would be useful for us as researchers. And then it's helpful to also think about wider decision-making processes. So you might just be thinking about a national level because it's a national problem, but sometimes that problem can spill over into other countries. It's useful to think about whether there are existing networks of stakeholders that you might want to tap into, and whether there are existing events or activities or communication channels that you might be able to tap into. So this is not a kind of a seamless list. This is kind of, as I said, a grab bag of ideas. So again, in the research that I did, we worked with the Indigenous community because they could help us understand a whole lot of issues from a cultural perspective. And although what we were doing in terms of the work that we were doing was focused on Australia, the US government took an interest in what we were doing because it was potentially a threat to the way that illicit drugs are handled worldwide. And they threatened the Australian poppy industry, the legal poppy industry, and said that, you know, if you go ahead with what you were planning to do, we would not buy any more poppies from the Australian poppy growers. And so that was kind of something we had to take into account. So the final thing to think about is the practicalities. And while they're important, as I said at the beginning, it's important that they're not the primary driver, that you think about these other issues as well. So obviously you'll have limitations in time and resources, which will also affect what you can do. Some stakeholders are much more accessible than others, and some are much more willing to be involved than others. And they might all, they're all considerations that you can take into account. So what I'd like you to do now is to have a chance to share your own experiences. We're going to break you into groups of 5 for 15 minutes. What I'd like you to do is a quick introduction. So please tell the other people in your group who you are and where you're from. And then just talk about what insights you got from what's been said, what you think's missing, what other comments. Again, because we have limited time, please be crisp. So you'll have 45 seconds each per topic. Please make sure everyone gets an equal turn, and please record your comments on the whiteboard. So Judith sent you some instructions for how to use the whiteboard, and it would be great if you would record them, because we can then, we could share them with each other, which would be a great thing to do. So are there any questions before you head off into small groups? Okay, Judith, over to you.
All right, so I opened the breakout rooms. There will be 4 to 5 people each, and then you will have moderators going in and out from some of the rooms to help you navigate the whiteboard function. So do you see people are joining? So that looks fantastic. And everyone is assigned.
Great, thanks, Judith.
Yes.
So how are we going, Judith? Is everybody back?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So thank you, everyone. I'm sorry I kind of rudely dipped in and out of the discussions. They were fascinating. I really would have liked to have been in all of the groups for all of the time, but it sounds from the ones that I was able to join that you are starting to grapple with some of the, or starting to share some of the issues that that concern you, which I'm hoping will. Okay, so it sounds like one of the discussions didn't go very well. So I'm sorry about that, but we'll have a couple more, so hopefully it'll work. So what I want to do now is so we've spoken about identifying, defining and prioritising stakeholders. I now want to move on to talking about engaging stakeholders. So really what we're trying to do is to have a very diverse group of stakeholders who can help us think about the problem. And so engagement is a way, if you like, of harnessing that diversity, harnessing the diversity in knowledge and perspectives, in problem definitions, in interests and values, in understanding contexts and in unknowns. The spectrum, the way that I find it really useful to think, I'm going to come to co-production or co-creation later, but I want to start with this modified spectrum from the International Association for Public Participation, IAP2, so International Association for Public Participation. And they talk about 5 types of engagement: informing, consulting, involving, collaborating, and empowering. And what I really like about this is that they're very clear that all of them have a place in the work that we do with stakeholders, that none are inherently better than the others. And it really depends on the circumstances of the research, which of those is going to be most appropriate. So it depends on the problem, it depends on the people that you've involved, it depends on the aims of what you're trying to do, and it depends on practical issues such as available resources and timeframes. So the thing that is also important about this framework, for those of you who don't know it, is that they also talk about the fact that this is not a one-way thing, that we also as researchers make a promise back to the stakeholders. And I want to come to this in a bit more detail in a minute. So I've taken their framework, and in the handout that you've, or in the slides that you've got, is a modification of their framework for research purposes. So theirs was about public deliberation, but this is about how to use that framework for research. So if we move from inform through to empower, we get increasing stakeholder influence on the research, obviously. And then there are 2 ways of thinking about this. So there's what's the goal of inviting them into our research, and then what's the promise that we should be making back to them for the research. So if we think about informing, so what we're going to do with the stakeholders where it's appropriately to inform them, how do we give them balanced information about the research? And the promise that we make to them is that we will keep them informed. For consultation, we get some feedback from them, and so we have to inform them and listen to and acknowledge their concerns and aspirations, and also let them know how we use their input. Involving is more than consultation, not as much as collaboration, so it's kind of halfway between. We're working with them more than we would just involving them, but not as much as collaborating them, to really try and understand what their concerns are. And again, in terms of what we do, is we keep them informed about what we're doing, and we tell them how we've used their input. In terms of collaboration, we're really partnering with them, and we may not partner with them for the whole of the research. We might only partner with them for some aspects of the research, but it's worth thinking about that. And we look to them for advice and innovation in designing and conducting the research. So this is a true partnership, so that it's very much a 2-way street. And then if we're empowering stakeholders, we're really assisting them in doing their research. So we're a resource to them, and the promise we make to them is that we will continue to be that resource for the course of the research. So if we put that together, it looks like this. And I want to just reiterate that all of those options are fine, that we often just go to the collaborate option, but all of them are fine depending on the circumstances of your research. It's important to be clear about what we're actually doing and it's important that we keep the promise that goes with whatever level of engagement we have. The useful thing I think about these options is that it helps us think about different forms of involvement at different times for different stakeholders. So it helps us really think deeply about the engagement. It helps us think about the fact that we can involve the same stakeholders in different ways in different parts of the research, that we can involve the different stakeholders in different ways so we don't have to involve everybody in the same way. And it also helps us think about what's feasible given the number of stakeholders and the size of the group. So if you've got a group of 100, collaborating with 100 people is really hard. Informing 100 people is really quite straightforward. So it's useful to think about all of those things in terms of the spectrum. So I'm going to invite you to reflect about how you interact with your stakeholders and how well you're able to keep your promise to them. So I'll just give you a couple of minutes to do that. Okay, so let's move on. So what I wanted, sorry, I should have put this up while you were thinking, because you could have had it in front of you. Anyway, there's also some great chat going on. I can't keep up with the chat, but thank you, and it's great to have that interaction going between you. As I said, part of what we want to do here is to encourage that. What I'm going to do is to talk a bit more about the co's, co-production, co-creation, co-design. These are terms that you used interchangeably, and then we'll have another small group discussion fairly soon with a different small group. So as I said, these are the terms that tend to be used interchangeably. And it's useful, I think, to know where these terms have come from if you don't already know that. So co-production comes from service improvement, and it's a concept that Eleanor Ostrom was one of the pioneers of. And she argued that if you're going to try and improve a service, in her case it was policing, you should also talk to the people who are using the service, not just the people who are providing the service. That's really the origins of that. Co-creation really started in a business context where businesses thought, well, maybe we should talk to the consumers a bit about what they want as well as what we're trying to develop. This was much less, even though they use co-creation as the term, it's much less collaborative than we might think. It was much more extractive in the way that this was developed, although it's not really the way that we use it now. Co-design comes from participatory design, which both in software and product design, but also in landscape and urban design for sustainability. Co-innovation comes from invention and commercialization. And then co-construction really comes from education, where there's the idea that teachers and learners actually co-construct knowledge. It's not so this is moving away from the empty vessel way of thinking about education to really thinking about how do the instructor and the participants really co-construct education. Trying to do that in a 3-hour workshop is actually really difficult, and we're doing I'll be interested to hear what you think about how well we're doing co-construction here. So I'm going to argue that co-production is a privilege, that it's a privilege on both sides. It's a privilege for us as researchers that stakeholders care enough about the issue that they want to get involved in our research. And it's also a privilege for the stakeholders that we invite to be co-producers with us. I'm just going to use co-production as the overall term now. It's also a privilege for them to be invited by us to be part of the research. And I think it's useful to think about it in that way. It's also really time consuming, as those of you who do it know. And I guess what I really liked about the conversations is that we've got a great level of knowledge from within the group, from beginners to people who've been doing this for a long time. One of the references that I've given you in the handout is a blog by one of the funders from Canada who says the important thing about co-production is that we need to say what we mean, we need to mean what we say, and we need to learn as we go. So we often call things co-production that are really only consultation. We often don't mean, we use the term but then don't follow through with action. And it's also something where we really need to be working together to learn from each other about about how we can do this better with the people that we are doing it with. So it's useful, I think, in thinking about co-production to think about the research stages and at what stage we're going to co-produce. I think we don't have to ask people to sign up to co-produce for the whole of the research. We might just want them to help us co-produce on the problem identification, maybe on the synthesis and interpretation. We may not want them to co-produce on the grant writing because that's really the area that we know something about. So it's helpful to think about all of that. And I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes to think about how co-production works in your research, and then we're going to go back into small groups, I think. And while we're doing that, I'll have a look at the chat. All right, thank you for everybody who's been contributing to the discussion as well, the chat. That's fantastic. We're not in small groups yet, Jean, but we will be going to small groups shortly. This is just a chance for you to reflect. So partly what we're doing is both reflection. So it's me talking at you. I'm giving you a bit of time to reflect. Some people like that, some people don't. And then we're going to move into small groups again. I might just say, unfortunately, as far as I'm aware, we can't capture the chat. Judith, is that right?
We are capturing it.
Yes,
Oh, you are capturing it. Great.
I'm taking notes on the chat as well.
Great, thank you, because there's such really good information. And if you're sending me private messages, please send them to me by email later, because I won't necessarily have access to the chat. Okay, so we're going to go back into small groups now. Again, 15 minutes. Now, you'll be in a different small group, and if you've already been if there are already people in the group that you've been together with before, and you're getting sick of introducing yourself, it's not too bad the second time, but this will happen a bit further down the track. Also think about, in future, introducing the other person. So pay attention to, to what you hear about the other person so you can also introduce them. So what I'd like you to think about now, so I want you to introduce yourself so that you'll know each other. I'd like you to think about what engagement and co-production mean to you, what engagement you do well and what you could improve. And again, please record your comments on the whiteboard. It was terrific to see so many of you using the whiteboard so well in the first breakout. So Judith, over to you.
So rooms are open. I tried to people
Can I ask
around.
a quick question on the whiteboard?
Yes.
Yes, Karen.
Because I typed on the whiteboard, and then when the groups were over, I think my whiteboard has gone. Is that possible? So do we have to save it before, or how do we?
Yes, you do have to hit save. That is on the right side of your annotation bar, and it saves locally as an image on your computer.
Okay, I didn't do this. Okay, for next time I know it.
For next time.
Okay, great, terrific. So I'm just going to do a few more slides and then we're going to have a break before the next discussion. So what I've done so far is to try to give you some frameworks that I hope will be helpful thinking tools about how to think about defining, identifying, prioritising and engaging stakeholders. But one of the things I've heard in a lot of the discussions is that you've already been talking a lot about the process issues, and so I want to spend a bit of time now talking about those. So there are questions like, how do you involve stakeholders who are wary of participation? How do you involve those who've been invited to participate in multiple projects and, you know, who are sick of it? How do you involve all the stakeholders in an equitable manner? How do you deal with power and resource differences? How do you keep stakeholders engaged over the long term? And I'm sure that you'd have many more questions to add to these. And maybe we can do that via the chat, but please also do it as part of the discussion groups. So I guess what I would argue here is that there are no simple answers to those questions, and that context matters, so that your particular research project and the context in which you're working is obviously important. Many of you will have already thought this out for yourselves, and I'm hoping what we will do is develop a list of longer questions and responses. That learning from experience, what I've heard, most of you are very open to learning from your own experience. there's also the challenge of learning from the experience of others. Life's not long enough for us to make all the mistakes that ourselves. It's useful to learn from other people's mistakes. What we don't have is good ways of sharing those experiences, and that's really what I2S is hoping to do, is to develop the channels that will allow us to share those experiences. And as you'll see from the handout, I run a blog, which is a community blog, and I'd really welcome people sharing experiences with that. Sabina, I heard that you've written a blog post, and I'm going to follow up with you to get you to share it with the blog that I run too. It's also helpful to derive some general principles, and that's what I'm going to get us to focus on after the break, and to share helpful tools, and I'm going to talk about a few of those. So in terms of the lessons from my own work that I think can start to become some principles, is to be genuinely open to learning from the stakeholders. For me, the fun of working with stakeholders is that they know stuff that they just give me a window into a whole lot of other worlds. So I don't know what it's like to be a policymaker. I don't know what it's like to be a drug user, or as I've heard some of you talk, a small gold miner. So if you don't find that fun, then you might well be in the wrong business. If people are wary, try to figure out why. If they don't want to be involved, why? Is it because they've been involved in other projects and they didn't get anything out of it? You all know this, building trust takes time. It also takes integrity on your part, and it also takes genuine respect of the other people. Be aware of prioritising efficiency over effectiveness. This is, I think I've heard many of you already talking about the challenges of working within a research context, and the people that we're working with just see time very differently from the way that we see it. But I've found that often it's helpful to work with different stakeholders separately. We often talk about bringing everybody to the table. I find it useful to have separate tables for different stakeholder groups. I only bring stakeholders together if I'm actually interested in the way that they interact and what they can learn from each other. Power differences are a reality. We often talk about trying to get rid of power differences. You can't. What you can do as a researcher is you can treat everybody equally, absolutely, but we can't pretend that power differences don't exist. There's been a lot of discussion where I've heard you all talking about the need for managing expectations, that people, and this is, because we all see the world in different ways, managing expectations can be really challenging. And it's also important that stakeholders get something out of being involved, even if we don't achieve the ultimate goal. So we invite stakeholders in because we want to improve something, but they need to get something out of it, even if that improvement doesn't occur. And so thinking creatively about what's in it for the stakeholders is a really important thing to do. I want to also just share with you, before we move into the break, 4 useful tools, and there are references to these in the handout. If you've got conflicting interests, principled negotiation is a great tool for resolving those. This comes from Getting to Yes. It's been around for a really long time. Some of you will know this already. If you're trying to plan a joint vision for change, then appreciative inquiry is a great method to use. If you want to make sure everybody has an equal vote, nominal group technique is a great technique to use. It's great for idea generation and problem solving. And if you want to do more than just give people an equal vote, but don't want people to know who said what, because who says what is also a really important influence. If you work with a hierarchical group, so I do work with defence, for example, where everybody waits to see what the general says, and then they all say, yes, I agree with that, whereas the private might have quite different useful ideas. The Delphi method's a great way of getting people to share what they think anonymously, and for people to work with the ideas without knowing who put the ideas forward. So these are some tools that you might find helpful, and I'm sure others of you will have other tools. So what I'd like to do now is to invite us to take a quick break. When we come back, I'd like you to go into small groups to talk about some of these process issues and to share your lessons about what you've learnt from doing it. And we're going to try breaking you into groups that have a mixture of people who've got a lot of experience and people who've got less experience, depending on projects that have started and projects that have been going for a long time. Some of you in projects that have started will also have a lot of experience. Then I want to, if there's time after that, I want to just talk about some additional challenges of working with the stakeholders who can make change happen, and then go back to the I2S framework and to wrap up. So let's take a break. Please be punctual. We will start again 10 minutes after. Thank you all very much. To the small groups. So welcome back, everybody. Thank you for coming back so promptly. So what we're going to do now is to move into small groups again to talk about what we were discussing just before the break, the challenges of the process issues. So again, you'll be with different people. Please introduce yourself. Please share your successes, share your failures, and add to the kind of principles or lessons learned. And please record your comments on the whiteboard.
Right, I have opened all the rooms.
Great, thank you, Judith.
Yes. Please save your whiteboards. So everyone is back now.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, there was some great discussions happening, and I hope you've all saved your whiteboards. Now, the whiteboards you'll need to send to Judith because they'll be on your computers. So those of you who have saved them, so please do that. We'd really like to see what you've come up with and also learn from that. And if there's enough material there, I'll collate it and send it back to you. It just depends how rich it was. But thank you. They looked like they were great discussions. Certainly what I heard was. All right. So what I want to do now is to spend a little time just talking about the stakeholders who can make change happen, because they're often the ones that are the most difficult to get your head around how to work with. But you know, obviously a lot of you have had experience doing this, so I'll be interested to hear what you have to say. So it's worth thinking about what change is it that we want to see as a result of our research. And I suggest that there are two options. One is to make change happen, and the other is to respond to change that's already proposed or is ongoing. That in terms of making change happen, there's a kind of a quest for ongoing improvement, if you like. And the other is that we want to combat practices or behaviours that have negative outcomes for individuals and societies. In terms of responding to particular change that's either proposed or ongoing, there are basically four responses: adaptation, mitigation, passive opposition, and active opposition. And so let me just put those back together again. So the point of this is to, when you're looking at which decision makers to engage with, it can be helpful to think about what's the change. You may not have an idea about what the change is, but if you do have an idea about what the change is, it can be helpful to think about that. So then it's also worth thinking about which of the stakeholders you need. Do you need to work with government or business or civil society?
Gabriele,
and are you trying?
They are requesting if you can put it in presentation mode. It will make
I'm so sorry. That that was a bad mistake. So let me just, sorry. Thank you for interrupting. It's obviously, it's been a long day. It's been, all right. So it's worth thinking about whether you are trying to influence government, business or civil society, and whether you think it's policy that has to change, so the overarching guidelines for action, or do you think it's practice that needs to change? And obviously more of these. So again, these are kind of thinking tools. What do you want to be, what kind of change, and who do you want to engage with for these stakeholders? So let me just give you a couple of minutes to think about. I'll come back to this slide to think about what kind of change and also who. So this is a bit more reflective time again. Yeah, so Marion's made a comment of surely we only need to know what we need to change after the research. That's often the case. But sometimes you know that there's a problem and you might have some ideas about it. And certainly these questions can kind of help you think about that. Yeah, thanks, Charbel. That was, as I said, these are thinking tools. These are not these are not hard and fast rules. So they're meant to be helpful in helping you think about which stakeholders and how to engage them. All right. So again, when you're thinking about how to engage these decision makers, it's worth thinking about this framework: inform, consult, involve, collaborate, empower. Usually empower is not something you're doing with decision makers, but you can, in fact. So sometimes decision makers find it really helpful to have outside groups shaking the bars a bit. It gives them added impetus to make change happen. The other two things you need to think about is your role in terms of both advocacy and driving change. So are you going to be a neutral, honest broker, or are you going to be an advocate for making change happen? And if you're going to be an advocate, how engaged are you going to get in trying to drive the change? These have obvious consequences. So losing your neutrality is not something to take lightly, and it's worth thinking about when it's justified. Some people would argue that when the research evidence is so clear that something needs to be done, then it can be worth taking an advocacy role. Smoking cessation is one example. Climate change is another one. But if you do become an advocate, you have to understand you can never go back to being neutral, so it's a big step to take. And you do need to become really careful about biases, particularly confirmation bias. We all suffer from confirmation bias. This is looking for what we believe in rather than dismissing the stuff that we don't believe. But it becomes even more important when you're an advocate. All right, sorry, I went. So I just want to come to another framework that might be helpful. This is a variant of power, legitimacy and urgency, and I suspect some of you know this. This is the stakeholder alignment, interest and influence matrix, and I'm going to focus on alignment and interest. So alignment is how well people agree with the problem definition and aims, and interest is whether or not they want to be involved in your research. So do they agree with what you're doing? Do they want to be involved with what you're doing? And it's useful to have this 2x2 framework. So there are groups with high alignment or low alignment and high and low interest. And then you kind of plot the stakeholders out in here. What's probably more useful is how do you interact with the groups in each of these 4 quadrants. So for the people who agree with what it is that you're trying to do and are very interested in the research, the idea is to develop an alliance. For the people who agree with what you want to do but don't want to be involved in the research, you might try and raise their awareness so that you move them from being in this quadrant over to this quadrant. For the people who have high interest in being involved in the research but actually disagree with what you're trying to do, you might want to see if you can change their minds or neutralise them. And for the people who aren't that interested in what you're doing and don't and aren't interested in being involved, you can safely ignore those groups. So this is a framework that is about, that only works if people who want to be advocates, who really want to think about the decision maker partners and how to interact with them. So the question is, what are the indicators to make the matrix? That's thanks for the question. That's the hard part, is figuring out where to put people. And if you go back to the handout that I gave you about how to identify stakeholders, there'll be some tools there for that. But what we don't actually have is very good tools for assigning people. And There's actually a lot of research that needs to be done to get better at these processes that I would encourage you to be involved in. And that's really the kind of focus of my work, is this methods theory development, so that we have more tools and frameworks at our disposal. So if you want to be effective, you need to understand organisational structures, how organisations operate and are interconnected, and you need to understand processes, so how decisions are made and actions are taken. So you need to understand who to engage with and when, where and how to engage. And theory can be helpful. So I'm not going to spend any time on this except just to show it to you. If you want to affect government policy, then there are theories that can help you understand how government policy works. So there are theories about the cycle of how policy change happens. And then as a researcher, you want to get involved before the decisions get made, not after the decisions get made. There's another set of theories about policy changing as a response to interest group pressures. So how do you then involve, as a researcher, which interest groups should you involve with? And then there's theory about entrepreneurship and windows of opportunity. And again, as a researcher, you can think about that. So the key messages for engaging well are that government, business and civil society are all options, that policy and practice, you need to think about, are you trying to influence policy, are you trying to influence practice? Are you trying to, and it's worth thinking about the fact that these are all systems, so the way that they're connected is also important. You need to understand structure and process. Theory can help, and all theories are partial. And I've just had a quick look at the chat. Yes, there are some important questions about global climate change and what do you do when people aren't interested. And we could spend an awful lot of time on that, but then we wouldn't finish at 8. So let me just invite you to reflect for a couple of minutes about who it is that you're aiming to target and when, where and how you're aiming to target. All right, so thank you. There are some great questions in the comments, so I'd invite you to also whip in there and have a look and to interact with each other there. So because we're such a large group, and because I would like to give everybody a chance to say one thing at the end, I think what we'll do is we'll now move into the wrap-up phase. So what I want to do is go back to the framework and just to kind of recap what we've done. So what we've done is to look at participation, particularly stakeholder participation, and we've done a little bit just now in thinking about, if we're focused on the change aspects, what are some of the things that will help us be more effective in thinking about that? What I'd like you to do is to reflect on using the framework as a guide, what it is that you and your team do well. Are there any gaps? And how can you bridge from what you do well to the gaps? And then how can the Belmont Forum help? And I want you particularly to make sure that you make notes on how the Belmont Forum can help, because the Belmont Forum is actually really interested in the answer to those questions. So, so thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye,
Thank you
everybody.
very much.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tatiana.
Thank you, Tatiana.